Hello everyone, and welcome back to Rob's Movie Reviews. Such a beautiful evening, I thought I'd sit outside and do my review out here tonight instead of being cooped up in the house. Now this week I want to continue in my series of horror films as we move closer to Halloween. Last week I wrapped up my four-part series on the best of the Dracula movies. And with this video, I'd like to start a short three-part series on my three favorite versions of Frankenstein. And we'll start right off with the original, the 1931 Universal Studios Frankenstein. And I'm also going to include a review along with it of the Bride of Frankenstein, which was released a few years later by Universal. Since the two movies kind of go together, both movies combined kind of tell the story of the entire Mary Shelley novel. Frankenstein, like I said, came out in 1931. It stars Boris Karloff, Edward Van Sloan, Dwight Frye, and Mae Clark. It is a terrific movie. A lot of the what would be horror movie tropes began with the Frankenstein, began really with the early Universal horror films, but Frankenstein really kind of set the tone for where Universal would go for the next decade and a half in their style of filmmaking. It was directed by the tremendous James Whale. He did a wonderful job with this film. The story of the movie, of course, it takes some liberties from Mary Shelley's novel, but it's basically the story. We start out, we see Frankenstein is in his castle, and he has created from body parts of other humans. He has sewn together his own creation with the assistance of Fritz, his helper, played by Dwight Frye. Dr. Frankenstein is played by Colin Clive, who does a wonderful job in this picture. Frankenstein builds his creature. He is visited the night that he intends to bring life to his creature by a mentor of his from when he was at university, Dr. Walden, played by the wonderful Edward Van Sloan. Let me just say, I really love Edward Van Sloan's work. He would be a staple in the Universal horror films throughout the entire decade of the 1930s, appearing in almost every major horror film done by Universal. Frankenstein harnesses the power of electricity from a storm that is brewing. He uses the electricity from the lightning to give life to his creature. We then see the creature a few scenes later, portrayed by Boris Karloff. He who had done a few movies for Universal, but this was his big breakout role because Boris Karloff was able to prove to the world just how tremendously good of an actor he was simply by pantomime. He had no lines in this film, but his facial expressions and his body language probably told the story better than had he been speaking. He was just so wonderful in the part, and everybody watching the movie at some point becomes empathetic with the creature and feels sympathy for him. The creature is tormented by Fritz, again, like I said, played by Dwight Frye. Fritz takes immediate disliking to the creature. He torments him with a torch. The monster is terrified of fire, and Fritz just loves to torment him. And it eventually leads to Fritz's death as he's in the monster cell with him one night, and he's torturing the monster, and it gets the torch away from him. And even though the death happens off screen, we have a pretty good idea what happens. Fritz is strangled to death and then hung by a rope from the ceiling. This is when Frankenstein and Dr. Walden confer with one another, and the decision is made that the monster needs to be destroyed, that it's a failed experiment. The brain which was put into the monster was from a criminal. He had intended to use the brain of a brilliant scientist who had recently passed, but in the process of stealing the brain from the university, Fritz dropped the jar, and the brain that they wanted was destroyed. So he grabbed the next one he saw, not knowing that it came from had come from a deceased criminal. The decision, like I said, is made to destroy the monster. Unfortunately, Dr. Frankenstein, ends up collapsing from pure exhaustion and malnutrition. He's been pushing himself too hard. He's taken to his father's home, where his fiancée, Elizabeth, played by the beautiful Mae Clark, is there to wait on him hand and foot and nurse him back to health. In the meantime, Dr. Walden attempts to dissect the creature and to cut it up, not knowing that the creature was heavily sedated, but not sedated enough, and the creature wakes up before he can really get started and strangles the doctor to death, and then escapes the castle and goes on runs amok through the countryside. This is where we kind of find out that the monster really isn't evil. He's like a child, like a newborn child. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know what's going on around him. He doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. He comes up on this cute little girl playing by the lake. Her father has walked into town. He's left her alone for an hour or so and told her to behave and stay on the farm. And she's playing next to the lake. She's throwing flowers into the water, and the monster comes out of the woods. And at first, the little girl, we think she's going to be frightened, but then she invites the monster to play with her. And this is where Boris Karloff's acting ability really shines through. He's just so convincing in this scene. You can see that childlike wonder in his eyes as he's playing with the little girl, and she's teaching him how to throw the flowers into the water. And then they run out of flowers, and not knowing any better, I guess he assumes that things that are beautiful or things that he likes belong in the water. For whatever reason, he decides that that's the appropriate thing to do, and he picks the little girl up and he throws her in the lake, and she drowns. Her father discovers her body later, takes it into town. That's when a mob of villagers get together with their typical horror movie trope, their pitchforks and their torches, and they go seeking out the monster. Dr. Frankenstein joins in the search. He ends up getting separated from the main group. He comes into contact with the monster. The monster grabs him and carries him into an old windmill, takes him up into the upstairs part of it. Dr. Frankenstein regains his consciousness, is trying to escape the creature, and in the meantime, the villagers have found out where the doctor and the monster are, and they show up, and they set fire to the windmill. And in a rage, the monster throws Dr. Frankenstein from the roof of the windmill. And we assume at the end of the movie that he is deceased from the fall. However, they added on an extra scene at the end of the movie after the mill burns down and the villagers celebrate the destruction of the monster. They added a scene where we find out Frankenstein is alive and recovering in his father's home, and he's preparing for his wedding with Elizabeth, and that's where the first movie ends. And it's, like I said, it's a great movie. It was far separated from the novel in a lot of aspects, but yet it held true enough to where the feel of the book is still there. Now, in The Bride of Frankenstein, which comes out just a few years later, which also stars Boris Karloff as the monster, and Colin Clive as Dr. Frankenstein once again, we discover that this movie picks up right where the first one left off. In the ruins of the burnt mill, we discover that the monster is actually still alive. And he escapes the ruins of the mill. Dr. Frankenstein, in the meantime, has decided that he no longer wants to continue with his research. He realizes what the abomination that it really was. Him and Elizabeth are now married. We have a different actress, by the way, playing Elizabeth in this film. Mae Clark has been replaced with Valerie Hobson, who really, I think they should have stuck with Mae Clark, but that's actually kind of a minor thing. It doesn't really hurt the film that much. I just really liked Mae Clark's performance from the first movie, and I think she should have been brought back. But anywho, Frankenstein has made his decision. He's not going to continue his work. This is when we are introduced to the maniacal character of Dr. Pretorius, played by Ernest Thesiger. He is absolutely wonderful. I just adore his work in this movie. The character of Dr. Pretorius is just wonderful. This is also where we see more influence from James Whale, who understood the idea of blending comedy in with horror. The first movie had been more straight-laced, where in this film he tends to blend a little more comedy into it. Not so much that it makes the entire movie, a comedy, or can even be closely considered a comedy, but there are some very humorous scenes, most of them involving Dr. Pretorius. Anyhow, Dr. Pretorius, he goes to Frankenstein, tries to convince him to continue his work, but he is turned down. Frankenstein doesn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. This is where Pretorius starts to try to cook up some kind of plan to blackmail Frankenstein into moving forward with his work, of course, with Dr. Pretorius's help. It just so happens while he's in the cemetery one night harvesting human body parts for his experiments that he encounters the monster. And this is also where we see in this film the decision was made to give the monster the power of speech. He has some lines in this movie, some very memorable lines. Dr. Pretorius is able to manipulate the creature because he's so simple-minded into assisting him, into forcing Frankenstein into continuing his work. And the way he does it is he tells the monster that if he helps him force Frankenstein into continuing his work, it will be so that they can create a mate for him. Because the monster, Karloff delivers the great line, "Living bad, dead good." He's upset. He doesn't want to be alive. He almost wishes he was dead again, but I don't think he understands the concept of suicide or how to end his own life. But the prospect of having a female mate like himself created by in the lab is very intriguing to him. So with the monster's help, Pretorius kidnaps Elizabeth and then uses her safety to blackmail Frankenstein into helping him move forward with the research. And this is when they get together in the lab and they create a female monster played by the beautiful and talented Elsa Lancaster, I believe is her last name. She plays the female monster, the Bride of Frankenstein. And even though she only gets just very few minutes of screen time at the end of the movie, in the final scene, her presence, her look, her incredible portrayal of the character was so good. It was so iconic that it's still to this day, everybody knows who the Bride of Frankenstein is. Everybody knows the look, and she became one of the most iconic universal horror monsters of all time with just that tiny 3 or 4 minutes of screen time. It was just like catching lightning in a bottle. But anyway, they create the female monster. She rejects Karloff's monster. She's afraid of him. This is when he decides he doesn't want to go on any longer. He throws a lever that causes a chain reaction in the reactor inside of the laboratory that's going to blow up the entire castle. He tells Frankenstein to take Elizabeth and get out. He belongs with the living. Then he looks at Dr. Pretorius and the bride, and tells them they belong with the dead, with him. And as Dr. Frankenstein and Elizabeth flee the castle and turn around and look back, we see the castle just blown to pieces, and thus ends the Bride of Frankenstein. Two of the most classic, most perfectly made universal horror films of the entire decade of the 1930s. I absolutely love the Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. If you haven't seen these, I'm sure if you're a horror movie fan, you've had to have seen both of these films. But if you haven't, oh, for the love of God, you have got to seek these movies out and watch them. They are just so brilliant. Yes, they're old, they're classic, they're in black and white, but that doesn't matter because the storytelling and the acting is just so good, and the atmosphere that's set is just so wonderful that just makes these movies timeless classics. So that's going to wrap up my review for this week. Be sure to join me back next week. I'll have my second installment in the 3-part series of the best of the Frankenstein films. Until then, you all take care.